Some dishonest bakers padded their loaves with plaster, sawdust, and bones. And the most basic ingredients were becoming harder to come by. You see, while the population of Europe was growing, the climate grew colder and wetter. Summers were shorter and more unpredictable, making farming difficult. There were also more wars, and people were hungrier. The lack of fresh, varied food hurt everyone, except, of course, those in charge of rationing food supplies for armies or running the grain trade. They profited from the shortages. As society grew more hungry, people had to change what they ate. Once they turned to less desirable cuts of meat, and then to less desirable animals, they turned to fish, and then to fish that most people didn't like. And finally, they turned to whatever plants and vegetables they could get, including seaweed. Seaweed was an easy catch for coastal communities. People would simply take rocks from the shore after the tide went out and scrape the algae off. Then they either dried it or threw it straight into their soups. Seaweed is rich in nutrients and iodine, which helps explain why many cultures around the world have incorporated it into their cuisine and medicines. But seaweed has a distinctive taste and smell that many people find unappealing. Its gamey flavor resembles a strong cheese with some pharmaceutical notes, and its odor evokes, well, let's say certain parts of the male anatomy. No wonder some medieval writers described eating seaweed as being akin to swallowing the stench of stale urine. Our medieval foragers probably wouldn't have been able to stomach this taste if they hadn't been desperate for nutrients. But perhaps their desperation was mercifully short-lived. With food so scarce, death stalked every village. While people are most vividly aware of plagues like the Black Death, the bubonic plague that killed millions in the 14th century, there were other, smaller outbreaks that took lives almost every year. Malnutrition weakened bodies and made them vulnerable to disease. In the 1300s, the outbreaks of what may have been smallpox, though scholars debate this, killed thousands upon thousands. The effects of each outbreak seemed to pass after a few years, but then a third outbreak arrived and lasted for 20 years. It's believed that this pandemic killed at least 25 million Europeans, perhaps as many as 50 million. That's between 30 and 60% of the total population. Given this unrelenting struggle to survive, the question isn't so much why was food so bad in the Middle Ages, but rather, how did people endure? And part of the answer, as with many things in history, lies in how we remember the past. We tend to judge other times based on our own values, standards, and expectations. And yet, it's precisely this tendency that prevents us from truly understanding long ago. Meals were never just food for medieval villagers. They were a source of comfort, a reason to gather together, and a way to mark the passage of time. Each ingredient carried cultural weight. Bread, for example, was so central to life that bakers had guilds and special rites. It was used for everything from building houses to baptism ceremonies. When you look at the long table of a king's feast, with its elaborately spiced dishes and rich meats, it looks strange and even repulsive to us. But for those dining there, it was a symbol of order and plenty within a chaotic world. Of course, some foods are just gross by anyone's standards. Roasted swan with its neck tied into a bow, peacock with its tail fanned out to resemble a devil fruit salad, made with pig's feet, chopped ears, noses, and lips mixed with curdled cream, all washed down with a glass of white wine. Yum! These dishes weren't meant to tantalize the tongue. They were meant to impress the eye. Anyone attending one of these feasts knew that they were witnessing something special. The idea was to overwhelm the senses with richness and extravagance, to convey abundance and delight. If you had eaten your fill of plain bread and porridge, this was a reminder that there was still beauty and pleasure in the world. You could marvel at the colors, textures, and aromas without feeling that you were missing out. After all, you had your daily bread. The swan may have been out of reach, but at least you didn't have to eat it. This sort of logic allowed people to appreciate different ways of living. It gave them something to aspire to. At the same time, it let them accept their own modest lives. One medieval proverb expressed this attitude toward wealth and food. A full belly makes a low voice. It was understood that those with little to eat could uncomplain about the quality of what the powerful had on their plates. Their place was to serve it. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was a statement, a social contract, even when it wasn't very good. Well, friends, our journey into the past has come to an end. I hope you enjoyed learning more about medieval Europe's cuisine. Before we part ways, please remember to show your support. Your comments and feedback mean a lot to me. Thank you for joining me on this adventure, and I look forward to bringing you more captivating historical tales soon. Until then, stay curious and keep exploring. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Time Travel. If you enjoyed the story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more. Do you not forget to leave a comment sharing where you're re-listening from and what time of day it is for you. I love reading your comments, and I love that this community has grown to include people from all over the world. If you'd like to support us, please consider becoming a member. Thanks for joining me. Bye. This is a story about food. It's about what people ate, how they got it, and what it meant to them. It's set in medieval Europe, the era of knights and kings, from about 500 to 1500 AD. It's a time we often think of as brutal and violent, when life was hard and most people were poor. But did we really have it that bad? I mean, we have plenty of fancy restaurants and supermarket aisles nowadays. So how could our ancestors possibly have had it worse? Well, first off, let's talk about their bread, a staple of medieval diets. They didn't have the modern flour and fancy baking techniques we do, so their loaves weren't exactly fluffy and delicious. Instead, they mixed their dough with ground acorns, powdered chalk, or even sawdust. The loaves that resulted were heavy, gritty, and barely nutritious. No wonder they often supplemented their bread with cheese, eggs, and milk from their animals. And then there was ale, the drink of choice since clean water was hard to find. Ale was basically beer made from water down by innkeepers and alewives trying to stretch their profits. This made it weak and sour, which earned them a reputation for serving bad booze. Imagine going to a pub and getting a drink that tastes like dishwater. Not exactly refreshing. The problem was that hygiene, or lack of it, was everywhere. People didn't know about germs or proper sanitation, so contamination was always a threat. Many peasants lived in small one-room cottages where animals shared the floor with the family. Their waste mingled with straw and dirt, creating perfect spots for bugs and vermin to breed. In crowded towns, filth piled up in the streets, flowing into wells and rivers. Food markets were especially dangerous, with flies swarming over raw meat and rats scurrying around. Diseases spread easily, striking rich and poor alike. Even King John of England died after eating too many peaches and drinking too much cider. They were likely spoiled and contaminated, leading to fatal dysentery, one of the worst outbreaks in human history. The Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, largely because of these filthy conditions. Carried by fleas on rats, the plague flew through towns, killing millions. With weaker bodies and poor diets, peasants had little defense against such sicknesses. Eating was a gamble every day. You never knew what might be lurking in your food. That was the reality for most of medieval Europe. But not every corner was completely grim. Monasteries, for example, often kept gardens and orchards, providing monks and nuns with fresh fruit, vegetables, and herbs. Their kitchens prepared more sophisticated meals, sometimes written down in early cookbooks. Occasionally, these religious places also gave out bread or food to the hungry as an act of kindness. However, such generosity could only do so much. Meanwhile, the higher-ups feasted while the lower classes struggled. Imagine being invited to a huge feast with long tables loaded with roasted pigs, golden peacocks, loaves of fine white bread, pies filled with meat and spices, and sweet treats made of sugar, sculpted into castles and fantastic beasts. Wine and ale flowed freely, spiced with flavors that cost more than gold. These feasts weren't just about enjoying food. They were displays of power and wealth. But even here, danger lurked. Food poisoning from bad meat was common, and overeating often led to painful illnesses. The church also influenced what people ate. Its rules required fasting and banned meat on many days, especially during Lent, a period of 40 days before Easter. For poor families who were already struggling to eat enough, this was an extra hardship. Some endured by eating just bread, watery soup, and dried fish. Others broke the rules, risking punishment, torn between their faith and the need to survive. For peasants, food was never certain. Every meal was a balance between hunger, scarcity, and risk. For the nobility, there was plenty of food, but it was still risky. For everyone, food was at the center of life, custom, and survival. Looking back from today, the difference is clear. Our supermarkets are full of food from all over the world. Refrigeration keeps our meals safe and tasty, and we can choose what we want to eat from huge selections. But our ancestors in medieval Europe managed despite the odds. They developed new farming methods, explored distant lands for new foods, and preserved traditional recipes. They also adapted to changing times, incorporating new ingredients and cooking techniques. They shared meals, told stories, and created connections through food despite the challenges they faced. Even though food in medieval Europe had its ups and downs, it played a key role in people's lives, shaping their habits, beliefs, and survival. It was more than just nourishment. It was a way to show wealth, make deals, and hold on to traditions. The story of food in medieval Europe teaches us about how our past affects our present and makes us appreciate the variety and abundance of food we have today. And now, my friends, it's time for you to join the feast. What would you add to the medieval table? How would you change the menu? Share your thoughts below. Remember, every voice matters. Your comments are like spices, adding flavor to our discussion. Let's keep this feast of ideas going. And don't forget to stay tuned. There's more history waiting to be uncovered. It's time to raise your virtual mugs of ale and make a toast to the past. Until next time, may your history be epic and your meals even tastier. Oh, and a quick reminder, keep an eye out for those digital rats carrying virtual plagues. It's always smart to wash your hands, even if we're just talking about keyboard warriors. Okay, that's it. Now go forth and conquer your hunger for knowledge. See you soon. When Giovanni da Montecorvino set out to conquer the world, his weapons were neither sword nor shield, but hammer and chisel. This Italian stonemason became one of the first European artists to master the art of perspective, traveling across the known world to learn new techniques and bring them back to Italy. He marveled at the towering Khambalik, the great city of Beijing, where Mongol emperors once ruled. And in India, he found Christian communities built around the warm embrace of church walls. But it was the intoxicating spice markets of the Malabar coast that held the greatest allure, where Chinese silk and pepper met Persian carpets and gold. By the time he prepared to return to Italy, Giovanni's chests were filled with cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper wealth beyond measure. But fate was cruel. Some accounts claim his ship sank before reaching home. Others say he returned, only to be ambushed and murdered on the outskirts of Florence. Whatever the truth, Giovanni's story reflects both the allure and peril of the spice trade. Fortunes for a few, dashed hopes for many. Now imagine yourself drifting to sleep in a bustling medieval spice market, the air thick with cinnamon and saffron, merchants shouting in a dozen tongues, baskets brimming with ginger and cloves. But behind the sensory wonder lies the reality. For peasants back home, a pinch of pepper was an unattainable luxury. Their meals, as we shall see, were far simpler: porridge, coarse bread, and little else. Europeans, including those who lived in palaces, ate very little meat. It is hard to find dishes comparable to today's recipes, and most cooks did not write down their recipes either. But records do survive from wealthy households that give us a small window into how they ate. When they weren't eating bread, which was often, Europeans of all ranks ate porridge made with grains such as wheat, barley, rye, oats, or millet. They might mix different grains or add other ingredients like legumes or fruit. For example, in a 14th century English household, a recipe for a dish called "a good thing for a man to make his belly full" involved boiling barley, wheat, and peas together. In Italy, recipes like piragolo alla Fiorentina mixed crushed almonds, rice, and spices into a savory broth. Across Europe, these broths and porridges were seasoned with chopped herbs or preserved fruits and spices. For example, a recipe from northern France used ginger and saffron to flavor the gruel. Sometimes the mixture would be thickened with eggs or milk, turning into something closer to a soup or a pudding. In other cases, small pieces of meat were added to enrich the dish, creating a stew-like consistency. Not every porridge was bland, though. Recipes like the English maw and mansipple, a kind of fish porridge, sometimes included beer or wine to add a sharp bite. A recipe from the Holy Roman Empire mixed boiled wheat with apples, cinnamon, ginger, and wine, creating a spicy sweet concoction. Thick slices of bread were the perfect vessel for soaking up the juices and flavors of these brothy dishes. But the bread that most people ate was not like the soft loaves we think of today. Peasants baked with whatever grains they had on hand, such as barley, rye, or even chestnuts, producing dense, heavy loaves that were hard to digest. Milling was crude, so bread was often gritty with bits of husk and stone. Wheat bread, though better, was expensive and mostly out of reach. Yeast was scarce, so many loaves were flat, more like crackers than bread. In some places, laws even forbade commoners from eating fine bread. By the late Middle Ages, however, some things were changing. As towns grew and traded, contact increased between different parts of Europe. In England, the long-distance trade of wool stimulated economic growth, drawing villagers into a wider market economy. This may have led to greater access to wheat and the knowledge of how to use yeast. Over time, the typical medieval peasant's diet began to change, although slowly. By the end of the 1300s, some peasants were growing more wheat and barley and less rye. This transition meant that they also started to eat more bread. Historians estimate that by the Black Death in 1346, about 2/3 of peasants' calories came from bread and the rest from vegetables, milk, and small amounts of meat, fruit, and eggs. In this system, bread was still the foundation of life, but it was no longer a solitary food. Instead, it sat alongside other ingredients in a variety of dishes. While Giovanni da Montecovino traveled the world collecting spices, medieval European cooks were experimenting with ways to stretch their ingredients. In England, a recipe called a good thriding for a Maynor whiff to make her husband glad instructed women to thicken a broth with grated bread crusts, minced herbs, and butter, then pour it over a pork roast. Such practices reflect a broader trend across Europe to transform humble ingredients into festive meals. In northern France, cooks combined chopped eggs with vinegar, chopped parsley, and spices, poured it over toasted bread, and topped it off with fresh berries. But these creative solutions couldn't overcome the reality of life during the Great Famine. Between 1315 and 1322, a series of failed harvests caused food shortages and soaring prices throughout Europe. Between 1315 and 1317 alone, grain yields plummeted by as much as 40%. By 1316, when the price of wheat quadrupled, society began to fracture under the strain of hunger. Chroniclers described people eating dogs, cats, and even the flesh of the dead. Historian O.J. Benedict described a village in northern France where 600 people died of hunger in just 3 months. All those who died of hunger were buried together in a common grave, Benedict wrote, for there was no one to bury them separately. The Great Famine claimed victims everywhere, killing perhaps a quarter of the population in some regions. But its impact varied across Europe. The south of France, central Italy, and coastal areas with access to fish fared better than other places. Still, no one was untouched. One woman who survived the famine was Margaret of France, whose husband, Charles the Short, had died in 1325. Her own death in 1349, along with half of her children and grandchildren, would usher in an era of misery in France, compounded by the Black Death. In retrospect, the years leading up to the plague seem almost idyllic. Between 1346 and 1350, Western Europe's population contracted by an estimated 30 to 50%. Some survivors found themselves better off because of the plague. With fewer people working the fields, some peasants demanded higher wages. Lords responded by forcing them back to the land, marking the beginning of the end for serfdom across Europe. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 temporarily shook the foundations of medieval society. But when leaders like Wat Tyler were killed, the revolt collapsed and life returned to normal. In France, surviving peasants continued to work the land under tight controls. While in Germany, the shortage of farm laborers encouraged manorial lords to grant peasants more rights and freedoms. Giovanni da Montecorvino's journey to the East may have reflected the tastes and appetites of the wealthy, but it was also emblematic of the potential rewards of a dangerous world. It was also a microcosm of the encounters shaping the medieval world, bringing the riches of Asia to the doorstep of eager Italian merchants. His story helps us understand how the desire for exotic goods sparked a global exchange, connecting distant corners of the earth through trade routes. However, the flip side of this exchange was the devastating impact it had on local economies and societies. The lure of Asian spices contributed to the Trans-Asian trade networks that facilitated the spread of diseases like the bubonic plague, forever altering the course of European history. As we close this episode, let's take a moment to appreciate your support. Your engagement with our content fuels our passion for bringing history to life. We're committed to making this series as entertaining and informative as possible, and we hope you've enjoyed learning about medieval diets. Let us know what aspects of medieval life you'd like to explore next. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an exciting new episode. Together, we can keep unraveling the mysteries and marvels of our shared past. Thanks for watching. In the cobbled alleyways of medieval Europe, amidst the clatter of commerce and the clamor of daily life, lived a man named Thomas. His life revolved around two simple things: cheese and his cat. Now, cheese may seem like an unlikely passion, but for Thomas, each mold of ripening dairy was a work of art, a testament to nature's alchemy. From the humble milk of goat to the complex tapestry of flavors, he understood the subtle science that transformed it into something extraordinary. His cat, a sleek, intelligent creature named Midnight, shared his passion. While Thomas crafted his cheeses, Midnight would lounge nearby, occasionally lapping at a stray drop or batting playfully at a wayward mouse. Their lives were quiet, almost bucolic, until one day when fate dealt them an unexpected twist. A royal edict rang across the land, heralding a grand cheese competition hosted by the Queen herself. The prize, a handsome fortune, and the title Royal Cheesemonger. For Thomas, it was a life-changing opportunity, a chance to elevate cheesemaking from a humble trade to a respected art form. But the competition was fierce. Renowned cheesemongers from all over the kingdom prepared to showcase their finest creations. Thomas, with his modest shop and unassuming demeanor, seemed an unlikely contender. Despite the odds, he decided to participate. Guided by his intuition and years of experience, he set about crafting his masterpiece, a cheese so exquisite it would redefine excellence. As he worked, Midnight watched, understanding more than any human the dedication and passion that went into each cut, each stir. When the day of the competition arrived, Thomas and Midnight made their way to the castle. Amidst the grandeur and pageantry, Thomas's cheese stood out. Its texture, its aroma, its flavor, all conspired to create an unparalleled sensory experience. The judges, including the Queen, were blown away. It was a triumph that defied expectations and established Thomas as a master of his craft. As the crowd roared with applause and the Queen placed the winning sash on his shoulders, Midnight purred with pride, rubbing against his leg in silent congratulations. Thomas had not only won the competition, but had elevated cheesemaking to a new level of appreciation. In the weeks that followed, the demand for Thomas's cheese skyrocketed. His shop, once quiet, was now a hive of activity. Customers from all walks of life lined up, eager to taste the cheese that had captivated the Queen. Faced with this sudden success, Thomas did not falter. With the support of Midnight, he expanded his operations, taking on apprentices and increasing production without sacrificing quality. His business thrived, providing not only for him and Midnight, but also for several families in the town. His fame even reached the royal court. and he was invited to personally deliver his cheese to the queen. Entering the castle, he found himself in a vast kitchen bustling with cooks and servants. The air was filled with the aromas of baking bread, simmering stews, and of course, cheese. Standing in the center of it all was the queen, her face lighting up as she saw Thomas and Midnight enter. "You have brought your famous cheese," she said with a smile. "I trust it is as magnificent as they say." And so began Thomas's new life. He continued to supply the royal court, traveling back and forth between his shop and the castle, always accompanied by Midnight. Life was good, but he never forgot his roots. He remained a simple man, passionate about his cheese and his cat, sharing his success with those around him. His story became a local legend, a tale told in hushed tones in the quiet evenings after the day's work was done. And somewhere in the heart of the kingdom, in a cozy little cheese shop, a sleek black cat dozed by the fire, dreaming perhaps of cheese and the endless possibilities of tomorrow. Our next story takes us to the rugged coast of Scotland in the dark days of the 18th century. This is the chilling account of Hamish and the ghost that haunted his Highland home. Hamish McTavish was a man weathered by the harsh realities of life on the Scottish coast. A fisherman by trade, his existence revolved around the unpredictable whims of the sea. Like the waves that crashed against the rocky shore, his life was marked by an unending struggle against the elements. A battle he fought not just for survival, but for the hope of a better day. His home was a small, sturdy cottage perched precariously on the edge of a cliff overlooking the turbulent North Sea. Within its stone walls, Hamish eked out an existence that was as simple as it was tough. There was little luxury in his life, but there was a haunting beauty that mirrored the wild spirit of the coast. One evening, as twilight began to paint the sky in hues of purple and gray, Hamish was met by an unexpected visitor. A young woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with an otherworldly luminescence, stood before him seeking shelter from the raging storm outside. Without hesitation, Hamish ushered her in, offering her warmth and a place by the fire. The woman, too weak to speak, could only nod her thanks before collapsing into a chair. As Hamish watched, concern etched on his weather-beaten face, the woman slowly regained her strength. She introduced herself as Morna and explained that she had been separated from her family during the storm and had taken shelter in Hamish's cottage in the hopes of finding her way back to them. Touched by her plight, Hamish offered to help her search, promising to find her family and reunite her with them. Together, they braved the storm, searching house to house. But as the night wore on and the wind and rain showed no signs of abating, it became clear that Morna might have to stay the night. Hamish, ever the hospitable host, insisted that she stay by the fire in his humble abode, assuring her that she was safe there. Through the long and lonely hours of the night, Hamish and Morna sat by the fire, talking in hushed tones about their lives, their dreams, and their fears. As the first rays of dawn peeked through the cracks in the walls, a sense of calm settled over the cottage. The storm had passed, and the sky was beginning to clear. It was then that Hamish noticed something strange. Morna, who had been so alive and animated the night before, was now nothing but a translucent figure, shimmering like a mirage in the morning light. With a start, he realized that the woman who had sought shelter in his cottage was no ordinary guest. She was a ghost, a spirit bound to the mortal realm, seeking peace. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Hamish knew he had to help Morna find peace. He spent the following days researching old records and speaking to the locals, piecing together the fragmented tale of her life. He learned that Morna had been a young woman who had tragically died at sea, her body lost to the unforgiving waves. He discovered that she had been engaged to be married. But her sudden disappearance had left her lover heartbroken and searching for answers. With this newfound knowledge, Hamish returned to the cottage where he first met Morna, standing at the edge of the cliff overlooking the churning sea. He called out to her, his voice echoing across the desolate landscape. "Morn, I know now why you are here. You seek to be reunited with your love one last time." Moved by his words, Morna's ethereal form began to glow. She turned to Hamish, her eyes filled with gratitude, and then, as if released from an unseen tether, she began to rise. As she ascended higher and higher, her form grew brighter until she was nothing but a radiant light soaring towards the heavens. With a final wave to Hamish, she disappeared from sight, leaving behind a profound silence that was broken only by the ceaseless cry of the gulls. Hamish watched her go, feeling a profound sense of peace, knowing that he had helped her find rest. From that day forward, Hamish's life was forever changed. The memory of Morna and the ethereal beauty of the Highlands stayed with him always, serving as a reminder of the unseen world that coexisted with his own. The line between the living and the dead, he knew, was often as thin as the mist that shrouded the mountains. And sometimes all it took to help a lost soul find peace was a little kindness and a lot of heart. And that, dear friends, is the tale of Hamish and the ghost that haunted his Highland home. If you enjoyed this spooky encounter, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more spine-tingling tales. Until then, sleep tight and beware of wandering spirits. Welcome to my channel. Today we are exploring what the common person ate in the Middle Ages. In this series, we've explored the feasts of kings and queens, but the reality of their banquets couldn't be understood without looking at the other end of the spectrum. What did ordinary men and women eat? If you'd like to support this series, please consider supporting us, the church, too. Controlled eating habits. With many fast days, and especially Lent, when meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden, people often endured monotonous diets. Yet in gaining convenience, we may have lost something the deep bond medieval people felt with the land, the seasons, and the hard labor behind every meal. One can imagine a medieval peasant walking into a modern store, picking up a bright packet of Cheetos, and shaking his head in disbelief. Real cheese, for peasants, impossible. As we lie down to rest in our modern world, stomachs comfortably filled with any dish we might desire, it is worth pausing to recognize the privilege of such abundance. Countless generations before us struggled through hunger and hardship, scraping together enough to survive so that we might one day inherit a life where food is plentiful. To them, the simple act of having enough to eat would have seemed nothing short of a miracle. The medieval period was not just one age, but several, each with its own challenges and trends. Early medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th to the 10th century, was a time of great upheaval. The fall of the Western Roman Empire left local leaders scrambling to fill the power vacuum. Agriculture, once a mainstay of the economy, was disrupted by wars, famines, and plagues. This era saw the beginning of the end for the Roman road system and aqueducts, which failed to be maintained and fell into disrepair, making long-distance trade and travel difficult. Forests that had been carefully managed by the Romans grew wild and bountiful, offering a resource that peasants could exploit. Fish and fowl were plentiful in the waters and skies, while pigs roamed freely, rooting for fallen fruit and foraging for sustenance. When animals were slaughtered, nothing was wasted. Every part of the carcass was used, including the less savory bits. Blood was saved and used in sausages, stews, and soups. The bones were simmered for hours to extract every last morsel of meat, and the remaining broth was highly prized for its medicinal qualities. The most basic staple of the peasant diet was bread. However, flour made from finely ground wheat berries was reserved for special occasions. For everyday use, peasants relied on coarser flour, milled from whatever grains they could grow or afford. Barley and oats were popular choices, but rye was becoming increasingly common. Peasants ground their grain by hand or with a small water mill, then baked their bread in communal ovens. By the High Middle Ages, starting around the 10th century, conditions began to improve. The population grew, and agricultural production rose as technology advanced and new crops were introduced. Fields were enclosed, livestock grazed on improved pastures, and manorial economies became more productive. Water mills powered by streams or animal-powered mills that ground grain were built throughout the countryside. Sugar, rice, tomatoes, potatoes, and corn arrived from the Americas, while spices like cinnamon and cloves came from Asia. Citrus fruits added a burst of flavor to the diet. Food preservation techniques evolved, with salt and sugar taking on new importance. Salt was crucial for preserving meat, fish, and dairy products, while sugar became a vital tool for making preserves, conserves, and sweetmeats. However, these culinary advancements couldn't erase the impact of the Black Death. As millions perished, food shortages and famines became widespread. Peasants who survived the plague faced a changed world. Labor shortages gave them more bargaining power, leading to higher wages and better working conditions. Famine breads like those made with peas, acorns, and sawdust were a testament to their resourcefulness in the face of scarcity. These hearty loaves might not have been visually appealing, but they provided essential sustenance during desperate times. Sawdust bread, surprisingly high in nutrients, was favored in regions where wheat and other grains were scarce. It was created by grinding sawdust from non-toxic hardwood, mixing it with water and perhaps a touch of flour or plaster, then baking the mixture into a dense, if unappetizing loaf. Despite these challenges, medieval cooks, both noble and peasant, continued to innovate. They developed hearty stews, savory pies, and succulent roasts that made the most of seasonal ingredients and honored the bounty of the land. Medieval peasants were deeply connected to the rhythms of the land. Their lives revolved around planting and harvesting crops, raising livestock, and providing for their families. Breakfast, if it was eaten at all, was a light affair consisting of bread, cheese, and ale. The main meal of the day was dinner, eaten around sunset after a long day's work in the fields. Lunch was a midday break for farm work and typically consisted of bread dipped into a communal pottage, a thick soup or stew shared among workers. Supper might have included remnants from the previous night's dinner, or whatever small game or fish had been caught that day. Medieval peasants were not only farmers, they were also foragers, hunters, and fishers. They gathered wild greens, herbs, berries, and nuts to supplement their diets. Men might hunt rabbits, hares, deer, or wild boar, while women and children collected eggs and fished for eels, trout, and other freshwater fish. For some peasants, fishing was an integral part of their diet, especially in regions like England's Norfolk and Suffolk, where rivers and meres, shallow lakes provided a bounty of eels. Eels were highly regarded and considered a delicacy, often served as a special treat. In contrast to the humble peasant fare, the tables of medieval nobility were a spectacle of culinary artistry. Serving in royal courts was an esteemed position, often held by prestigious guilds, whose members took pride in their craft. Cooks and kitchen staff prepared sumptuous meals featuring an array of dishes from across Europe and beyond. Ingredients were imported from distant lands, ensuring that noble feasts were a fusion of flavors and textures. A typical medieval noble banquet began with appetizers served on silver platters, progressing to main courses presented in intricately designed ceramic or silver dishes. Enormous loaves of bread, towers of meat, pies, and vast quantities of wine were not uncommon sights at banquets, encouraging guests to consume excessive amounts of food and drink. Such overconsumption often resulted in discomfort or worse. Feasts, though spectacular, demanded constant vigilance from the royal kitchen staff. Cooks and their assistants had to balance the challenges of preventing spoilage and overconsumption, ensuring that each dish was not only visually stunning, but also safe to eat. They meticulously followed recipes, carefully measured ingredients, and employed innovative cooking techniques to preserve the freshness and quality of each dish. Their dedication was crucial to the success of every royal feast. As we watch and learn about the daily lives of medieval peasants and nobles, it is important to remember that they lived in a world vastly different from our own. Their struggles to put food on the table, their celebrations around bountiful harvests, and their losses due to famines and plagues, all paint a vivid picture of life in medieval Europe. We see a society shaped by the land, the seasons, and the labor of its people. Though separated by centuries, their story is one that resonates with the human experience, reminding us of the challenges our ancestors faced and the resilience they displayed in the pursuit of a simple necessity: food. Now it's time to hear from you. What surprised you the most about what commoners ate in the Middle Ages? And do you think you could survive on a medieval peasant diet? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to join us next time as we continue to explore the captivating past. What do you think about when you hear the word feast? Perhaps images spring to mind of long, lavishly set tables laden with delectable dishes, of friends and family gathered together, enjoying good food and good company. Or perhaps you're reminded of seasonal celebrations, of tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, jugs of ale and platters piled high with fresh fruit. Whatever your thoughts, there's no denying that the word conjures up images of plenty, of satisfaction, of celebration. In other words, the word evokes a world away from the reality of what eating was like during the Middle Ages. A world in which food was frequently scarce, unpredictable, and dangerous, in which obtaining the ingredients for a simple stew required a dangerous journey through forest or fen, in which a humble loaf of bread might contain more sawdust than saw, and in which a feast could mean something altogether different. Welcome to this house. Today, we're going back in time to reveal the dark side of the medieval table. One of the most startling facts about life in medieval Europe is the extent to which its inhabitants went hungry. In many ways, this seems almost unbelievable. The medieval period lasted from the 5th to the 15th century, a time which encompasses two of history's three great agricultural revolutions. By the end of the medieval period, Europe's population had reached around 75 million people. During these 8 centuries, new farming techniques, including the heavy plow and the three-field system, increased productivity, while innovations like the horse collar increased the efficiency of farm animals. This should have translated into plenty for all. Right, well, not quite. The problem was that although production increased, distribution didn't keep pace. Much of the food produced ended up in the hands of the nobility, or worse, in the hands of the church, both of whom were remarkably profligate, whilst much of the rest was lost through waste and inefficient storage. So despite regular famines, peas and fallows, food shortages, the Black Death, and a healthy dose of outright greed, the medieval peasant found himself or herself in a perpetual state of hunger. Sometimes the only thing standing between them and starvation was the charity of those very same nobles and the church. The church was by far the largest landowner in medieval Europe, controlling around a third of the continent's land. Some of this land was used to support the clergy, but much of it was rented out to tenant farmers. These vast estates were worked by the peasants, who paid rent in money or in kind, usually with a portion of their harvest. What they had left over was theirs to keep, although how much they actually ended up with depended on the whims of the landowner. Manorialism, the economic system that characterized medieval Europe, meant that peasants were tied to the land and obliged to work on the Lord's domain. The communal fields reserved for the Lord's personal use. How much time they spent doing this varied from place to place and over the course of the medieval period, but it could be a lot. On top of this, the peasants were also expected to offer their services to the Lord at times of crisis, such as when the harvest failed, or there was a need to store grain for an anticipated lean period. With all these obligations hanging over them, it's little wonder that the peasants were often reduced to eating whatever they could grow. Roots and berries, nuts, and the occasional rabbit. When things got really tough, they'd eat acorns, which they either ground into flour and made into bread, or boiled and mixed with other vegetables to make a kind of soup. Believe it or not, there was even a medieval cookbook dedicated entirely to recipes featuring acorns, given the opportunity. However, they would prepare hearty vegetable stews, offering a hot, filling meal to sustain them through the day. Such mercy gave brief relief, though it could not erase the larger truth. The church itself owned vast estates and often enforced the very restrictions that kept the poor starving. Its dual role, both benefactor and oppressor, was at the heart of medieval life, and so food became more than mere sustenance. It was a weapon of power, a reminder of inequality, and a symbol of survival against all odds. While the peasants ate whatever they could lay their hands on, nobles and the church hierarchy indulged in some serious feasting. Banquets were central to medieval royal culture. More than just a meal, they were a way of displaying wealth, affirming status, and building alliances. At a royal hall, you'd find glittering goblets filled with exotic wines and spiced ciders alongside platters piled high with roast boar, venison, and fowl. There'd be tarts and pies filled with succulent fruit and pastries dripping with honey and sugar. In short, everything the starving peasant could only dream of. The center of attention was usually a great joint of meat, perhaps a whole roasted boar, a symbol of wealth and excess. The meat would be carved at the side of the table by the king or the most honored guest, ensuring everyone saw the spectacle of plenty. But while this may sound like an idyllic picture of medieval life, the reality was far more brutal. Wild boars are notoriously ferocious, tusks as long as daggers and tempers to match. Hunting them was a dangerous business, requiring skill, stamina, and a little bit of luck. The boar would often be served as a symbol of the hunter's prowess, a trophy to be displayed before being shared among the assembled company. But what if you weren't at the king's court or a member of the nobility? What if you were a lowly peasant whose days were spent working the fields and whose nights were spent worrying about where your next meal would come from? For these people, food was a constant struggle. They might grow a small patch of vegetables, but even that was a risky business. The weather could fail, crops could spoil, and pests could decimate a season's work in a matter of hours. Bread, the staple of the medieval diet, was a particular challenge. Flour was expensive and in short supply, so it was adulterated with whatever was to hand. Plaster, bones, sawdust, bones, or the bodies of small animals. Add in the fact that bread was bought and sold by weight, and it was uncommon for bakers to get away with giving their customers less than they paid for. To make matters worse, salt, an essential ingredient in making bread rise and giving it flavor, was in very short supply and prohibitively expensive. And so the humble loaf of bread, a necessity of life, became a battleground in the fight against scarcity. Peasants relied on a mixture of grains to make their bread, whatever they could afford, including rye, oats, barley, and wheat. Wheat was the easiest to come by, but the most expensive. Oats and barley were cheaper, but trickier to notice if they'd been mixed with sawdust or plaster. Rye was in high demand, meaning it was harder to adulterate. Each type of grain had its own properties, its own texture and flavor, and each was susceptible to different types of contamination. Wheat, the most popular choice, could be icily, mixed with plaster, small pebbles or bones, all of which added texture, but none of which improved the taste. Oats and barley, meanwhile, were ground with sawdust, which didn't affect the bread's consistency, but it did dull its flavor. Rye, the cheapest option, was sometimes mixed with small stones or pebbles, which added a gritty texture to the finished product. But why would anyone risk selling such inferior bread? The answer was simple. If you couldn't afford the pure stuff, you did what you had to do. You mixed in whatever you could get your hands on, be it sawdust, plaster, bones, or pebbles. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheaper and it stretched the flour further, meaning you could make more bread from less flour. And in a world where food was constantly in short supply, that was a godsend. Medieval brewers also stretched their ingredients, adding extra grain to their mash to make more beer. But they weren't motivated by the same necessity as the bakers. In fact, brewing more beer was actually a source of additional income for them. They could sell their surplus beer to passing travelers or local nobles, thus bringing in a little extra money to supplement their meager wages. So the next time you sit down to a meal, whether it's humble or grand, pause for a moment. Taste not just the flavors, but the history behind them. Remember the peasants who endured hunger, the merchants who risked death for spices, the brewers and bakers who bent the rules to survive. Their world was bleak, harsh, and often bitter, but it was their endurance that built the foundation for the abundance we now take for granted. The year is 1348, and Europe is in the throes of the Black Death, a cataclysmic plague that will claim an estimated 30 to 50% of the continent's population. Villages are being wiped off the map, families torn apart, and entire communities are facing annihilation. But in the midst of this horrifying devastation, a peculiar sight has emerged. Men, women, and children are turning up at church doors, bearing sacks containing the bodies of the dead. What's happening? Are these people willingly bringing the plague upon themselves? Well, not exactly. You see, what they're doing is called flying the plague, and it's a grim adaptation to the desperate circumstances of the time. See, when the plague first arrived in Europe, it was devastating. Entire villages were being decimated, and the survivors were struggling to cope with the mass death and the breakdown of social order. As things started to get really bad, people began to take drastic measures. When someone died of the plague, they were typically buried in shallow graves near their homes. But this practice soon became untenable as more and more people perished. That's where flying the plague came in. Instead of burying the dead, villagers would carry the bodies of their loved ones to church doors, effectively passing them on to the next village. This macabre practice allowed the survivors to save themselves the trouble of digging graves and dealing with the dead, while also spreading the plague to other areas. It was a terrible solution to a dire situation. But what makes this story truly fascinating is the fact that it is just one example of the lengths to which people went to survive the Black Death. Throughout Europe, individuals and communities confronted the plague in different ways. Some fled to the countryside, hoping to escape the crowded cities where the disease was rampant. Others locked themselves indoors, sealing their fates alongside their loved ones. Still, others turned to religion, seeking solace in prayer and the promise of divine mercy. The plague had an impact on every aspect of life in Europe, from the economy to the social structure, and even the art and literature of the time. It killed millions and left an indelible mark on European history. Now, if you want to learn more about this dark chapter in human history, there are plenty of resources available that can provide more information. But in the meantime, let's return to the gruesome spectacle of flying the plague. Imagine the scene. Men, women and children, staggering toward a church, each carrying a sack that holds the lifeless body of a loved one. The air is heavy with the stench of death, and the sight of the emaciated faces of the children is enough to turn one's stomach. Once they reach the church, the villagers leave the sacks at the door and flee, hoping that the plague will spare them for now. But the grim reality is that they've only traded places with the next village, and the cycle of death and despair will continue. Now, it's important to note that flying the plague wasn't a universal response to the Black Death. Different communities across Europe developed unique coping mechanisms and burial practices based on their beliefs and resources. For example, some Italian city-states, such as Venice and Genoa, implemented quarantine measures to prevent the spread of the disease. Meanwhile, in England, the wealthy fled to the countryside, leaving the poor to fend for themselves in the cities. But no matter how diverse the responses to the plague may have been, the overall impact on European society was devastating. The massive loss of life led to labor shortages, economic instability, and widespread fear of contagion. These effects would reverberate throughout the continent for years to come. But despite the horror of flying the plague, it's important to remember that it was just one example of the many ways in which people coped with the Black Death. There were medical practitioners who experimented with new treatments, religious leaders who offered words of comfort, and ordinary people who simply tried to carry on with their lives in the face of death and despair. The Black Death remains one of the most significant events in world history, and its impact on Europe is still felt today. And while flying the plague may seem like a bizarre and disturbing footnote in that history, it's actually a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of those who lived through one of the most devastating plagues in recorded history. Now, the plague wasn't the only thing affecting people's diets during the Middle Ages. In fact, the entire period was marked by a lot of change when it came to food and eating habits. Let's take a look at what else was going on. For one thing, the Middle Ages saw a lot of innovation in cooking techniques and recipes. As new ingredients were introduced to Europe, cooks got creative and came up with all sorts of delicious dishes that we might recognize today. For example, the medieval recipe for blancmange might sound strange to us now, but it was basically a savory pudding made with meat, spices, and sometimes even fruit. It might not sound particularly appetizing, but it was a popular dish among the nobility. But of course, not everyone was so lucky. In fact, the vast majority of people in the Middle Ages were living in poverty, and their diets consisted mostly of whatever they could grow or hunt. For peasants, a typical meal might consist of a thick soup made with vegetables, grains, and sometimes meat or fish. While this might sound simple to us, it's important to remember that these people were often working long hours in the fields and needed food that would keep them full and energized. And don't forget about the staple of the medieval diet, bread. Whether it was made with wheat, rye, or barley, bread was a must-have for people of all social classes. In fact, the price of bread was so important to the economy that the value of currency was often measured in terms of how much bread it could buy. Of course, bread was more than just a source of sustenance. It was also an important symbol of wealth and power. For example, the king's baker was a highly coveted position, and the royal family had their own special breads that were baked to their exact specifications. But perhaps the most memorable aspect of the medieval diet was the role that alcohol played in everyday life. Beer and wine were enjoyed by people of all ages and were often served at important events and festivals. In fact, beer was so important to medieval life that there were even laws governing how it could be brewed and sold. During the Middle Ages, food was more than just a way to stay alive. It was a reflection of the times and a way for people to express their identity, wealth, and power. From the spices enjoyed by the elite to the hearty breads consumed by the masses, the medieval diet was as diverse and complex as the people who ate it. Now, if you want to learn more about this fascinating period in history, be sure to check out the series. We've covered everything from the origins of the plague to the daily life of medieval peasants. So if you're hungry for more knowledge, be sure to check it out. And until next time, happy feasting. The year is 1349. You are a poor peasant living in a village in medieval Europe. Your days are spent working the fields. Your nights are spent sleeping in a cold, damp cottage with your family and livestock. The Black Death has just swept through Europe, killing millions and leaving many villages depopulated. Food is scarce, and there is a constant threat of starvation looming over you and your loved ones. What would you eat during the Middle Ages? Well, if you were a poor peasant, you might be eating some gruel and hoping for the best. Gruel was a simple dish made from boiling grain in water and was a staple of the peasant diet. It was bland and watery, but it was filling and could be stretched out to last for days. Of course, it wasn't the most nutritious meal, but when times were hard, it was better than nothing. Now, let's take a step back and look at what the average person ate during the Middle Ages. While gruel may have been the go-to for peasants like you, the average person's diet was much more varied. But don't get too excited because variety doesn't mean plenty. Most people, regardless of their social status, ate a monotonous diet of mostly grains and vegetables. Meat was a rare treat and was usually only eaten on special occasions. However, there was one group of people who really enjoyed meat, and they were the nobility. While the average person may have been eating vegetables, fruits, and grains, the nobility was enjoying a diet that would make any carnivore drool. They regularly ate meat and sometimes even wild game like boar and deer. They also enjoyed pies filled with meat and fish, and would frequently have venison served up as a delicacy. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about the food here. I would love to dig into a pie filled with meat and fish, but it's important to remember that the average person couldn't even dream of such a meal. There was a stark contrast between the diets of the rich and the poor during the Middle Ages, and it's clear that the nobility really knew how to live. But let's not dwell on the fact that most people were probably starving. Let's talk about something that everyone could enjoy: bread. Bread was a staple of the medieval diet, but it wasn't always what we think of when we imagine a crusty loaf of bread. In fact, during the Middle Ages, bread could be made from a variety of grains, including wheat, rye, barley, and oats. The type of bread that a person ate often depended on their social status. For example, the wealthier members of society could afford to eat white bread, which was made from finely ground wheat flour. This was a luxury item since it took more time and resources to produce. On the other hand, the poorer members of society were more likely to eat coarser breads made from less expensive and lower quality grains. They were often mixed with other ingredients like sawdust or plaster to make the dough last longer and stretch their resources. Yikes, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. And it was. Actually, these breads were not only difficult to notice due to the unappetizing additions, but they were also hard to digest. That being said, they were still an essential source of calories and nutrients for the peasants of medieval Europe. So even though the bread they ate may not have tasted good, it was a necessary part of their diet. And I can't blame them for trying to make the best of a bad situation. After all, they didn't have the luxury of throwing away food like we do today. Every crumb counted. But it wasn't all bad. There was one type of medieval bread that was actually pretty delicious, and it was gingerbread. Gingerbread was a spiced quick bread that was popular in medieval Europe. It got its name from the addition of ginger and other spices to the dough, which gave it a sweet and spicy flavor. Unlike the sawdust and plaster-laden breads, gingerbread was a treat that could be enjoyed by people of all social classes. It was often served during the Christmas season and was popular among children. It might sound strange to us today, but back then it was quite the delicacy. But that's not all. Medieval gingerbread was also known for its decorative qualities. It was commonly shaped into elaborate designs. It was sometimes used as a Christmas tree decoration. That's right, people were eating off of Christmas trees long before Santa Claus came along. So while the bread of medieval Europe may not have been the most gourmet fare, it was certainly interesting and diverse. From the plain and practical to the spiced and festive, there was a bread for every occasion. But don't forget that not everyone could enjoy this variety. The lack of access to quality ingredients meant that the poor were stuck with sawdust bread, while the rich were enjoying their fancy white loaves. It just goes to show that even the most basic of foods can be a source of inequality and hardship. But let's move on to a more cheerful topic: fruit. During the Middle Ages, fruit played an important role in the diet of people across Europe. In fact, some fruits became so popular that they were considered symbols of wealth and power. Let's take figs, for example. Figs were highly valued during the Middle Ages and were seen as a symbol of wealth and luxury. They were often imported from the Middle East and were too expensive for most people to eat regularly. Only the richest households could afford to purchase and enjoy fresh figs. However, there was one fruit that was more accessible to the common folk, and it was apples. Apples were a popular fruit during the Middle Ages and were grown throughout Europe. They were a versatile ingredient that could be eaten raw, baked into pies, or turned into cider. In fact, apple trees were so widespread that they became a symbol of paradise in medieval art. Other fruits that were popular during the Middle Ages included cherries, plums, pears, and strawberries. These fruits were often enjoyed during the summer months and were seen as a treat after the long winter. However, the availability of fruit could vary depending on the region and the season. Some fruits, like citrus fruits, were not commonly grown in Europe and had to be imported. As a result, they were even more expensive and exclusive to the wealthy. Overall, fruit played an important role in the medieval diet and culture. They were not only a delicious and nutritious part of meals, but also a symbol of wealth, power, and even paradise. And let's not forget about dairy products, which were also an important part of the medieval diet. Milk, cheese, and butter were commonly consumed by people across Europe, regardless of their social status. However, the availability and consumption of dairy products could vary depending on the region and the season. For example, in mountainous regions like Switzerland, dairy farming was an important part of the local economy, and cheese was a staple of the diet. In fact, Swiss cheese is still famous around the world today. On the other hand, in regions where dairy farming was not as common, people were more likely to rely on eggs and meat for protein. During the Middle Ages, cows were the most common source of milk and dairy products. They were raised on farms and in monasteries, and were used to produce milk, cheese, and butter. Goats were also kept for their milk, but their products were more likely to be used for local consumption. Sheep and pigs were not commonly used for dairy purposes, but their meat was a valuable commodity. But don't think that everything was hunky-dory in the dairy department. There was one big problem lurking around the corner, and it was dangerous milk. That's right. Milk was often unsafe to drink during the Middle Ages and was frequently contaminated with dirt, bacteria, and animal feces. This led to a high rate of infant mortality and a general distrust of milk among the population. To make matters worse, milk was often adulterated with water or the milk of other animals to increase its volume and make more profit. This further increased the health risks associated with consuming dairy products. Overall, dairy products were an important part of the medieval diet, but they also posed significant health risks and economic challenges. We hope you've enjoyed learning about what people ate during the Middle Ages, from the peasant who ate gruel to the noble who dined on roasted meats and spiced wines. The medieval diet was varied and often surprising. We'd like to know, what was your favorite medieval food that we discussed in this video? Leave a comment below and let us know. Don't forget to subscribe for more exciting historical tales. And until next time, keep learning and stay hungry.